it's hard to sort of start that conversation sometimes for adults because a lot of us in some ways are non-confrontational, or we don't want to deal with a kid in the same way we would deal with an adult. Some of us are happy to talk with an adult and go, look, we have to have a conversation and be clear about these things. You may not want to go to a kid and say that. So a lot of times I write books to give parents or adults a way to sort of have a springboard into talking about subjects. But it's hard sometimes to find that in.
Welcome to the Skiffy and Fanty Show.
He pulled the memory of his mom close. Her smile, her perfume, her fingers as she combed and braided his hair. Gotta keep pushing, baby, no matter what.
Well, I'm Sean.
I'm Trish.
And today we are joined, for the second time trying to do this because I'm a dum-dum, and it happens, by the Shirley Jackson Award finalist Eden Royce, author of the middle grade novels Root Magic and Contra Island, which we have interviewed Eden about on this podcast, the Spooklights collections of short Southern Gothic horror stories, and the recently released novella Hollow Tongue, which you can read a review of on our blog, by the way. But today we are talking to Eden about her latest middle grade novel, that is The Creepening of Dogwood House. Welcome to the show, Eden.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be back.
It's lovely to have you. It's also really easy. You just email us and then we're like, oh my gosh, yes, you can just come back on. So yeah, we don't have arguments about it.
It's good to know.
Well, before we get to that, Trish, what should folks know?
A reminder to get to our listeners to please share your questions and comments with us at skiffyandfanny.com/listener suggestions. If you aren't here already, join us on Twitch on Sean's Alphabet Streams channel Fridays at 7 p.m. Central to be a part of our interactive live streaming format. Please tell folks about this show and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Word of mouth is a big deal for fan-run productions, and we need your help to find new ears for this ridiculous show.
And it is ridiculous. We've been doing this since 2010, y'all. That's almost 15 years of this.
Wow.
Wonderfully ridiculous.
Yeah, it's, we don't make good life decisions. Okay, so The Creepening of Dogwood House, Eden. What is this book? What's the deal?
Well, first thing I want to say is this is a copy that I received just today, actually, in the mail. So fortuitous that my copies showed up today. So behold the full jacket cover, gorgeousness, cover art and lettering actually by Geneva Bowers, who did an amazing job with the cover here. So I had to sort of showcase that first. But The Creepening of Dogwood House is the third in my middle grade series of books about voodoo. And it is the Haunted House one. The first one was much more Southern Gothic / magical realism, Root Magic. Contra Island is very firmly a fantasy. So the third book is the actual creepy, scary, haunted house story, which I absolutely love horror. So this was sort of, I don't know, this one seemed to just almost write itself. Not exactly write itself because it was a lot of work, but it almost wrote itself. So it's about the hoodoo practice of hair burning. It is about starting over when it is the absolute last thing you expected to have to do. It's about remembering your ancestors and fighting for your newfound family. So just a quick, short synopsis. Roddy's mother unfortunately passes away in an accident, and because he doesn't have any other family, or so he thinks, he ends up in an orphanage for a few months until his aunt finds out about it, comes back to South Carolina to scoop him up and take him back to the family home, which she had been renting out for years and years and years, to find this dilapidated haunted house type structure that his aunt and uncle are totally in love with there and fix it all up together. There is some presence in the house, and there's something going on in the house that is affecting everyone, and he's the only one that can actually do anything about it.
Cool. So there's a question here that Trish actually wrote, but it has no other information attached to it, and so I'm just going to ask it, and you can interpret this question however you like. It's our first question, and that question is, why?
Blaming me on your weirdness, Sean.
I didn't write that question, Trish. I did not write it. So if you didn't write it, someone else put a...
Must have been Daniel. Blame it on Daniel.
Question. Why? Yeah, it's Daniel's fault. Why? Why, Eden?
Did somebody accidentally just hit like return or something? It just accidentally went to the next line.
We could just go to the next question.
Or they just cut and pasted it and they said, oh, you know what? I'm going to ask this later. I'll go back to the first question and fill that back out later. And that just didn't happen. But I could answer the question. I don't know if it would necessarily be in relation to the creepening, but I could.
We like open answers. Sorry. We like open-ended questions and answers here.
Why? Because I love horror and I think kids need to read more of it. Everybody needs to read more of it because it is an absolutely phenomenal genre for not only conveying information, but also for taking your reader on a journey that is going to be resonant even after you close the book. Ooh, that sounded like a professional answer. Look at that.
That's a good one. Yeah. But so on that subject, could I ask then, you've written quite a few creepy books, different ways of creepy, like things that can be a little macabre and little, this is like a haunted house story. And so it's obviously in some very familiar, at least at its base level, horror tropes, or horror story types, I suppose you could say. Do you worry about scarring children for life with creepy stories, or do you think that that's actually like, where does that come from, that desire to scare kids a little bit?
I do not worry about scarring kids for life. I think that kids can actually learn a lot from horror. I have also seen and read other people's books that they have so-called written for kids, and I realized I'm fine. People have written things much more scarring for children than the stuff that I write. I have seen things that were written for kids, some of which have been adapted into film or TV shows, supposedly written for children that I just go, yeah, okay. Let your, 7 or 8-year-olds watch this by themselves in their room with the lights off. Okay, great. So no, I am absolutely not worried about scarring children for life. I think one of the things I always try to write in my middle grade is things that kids can learn. And yes, you can absolutely learn from horror because I think there's this thing that adults sometimes forget when they get to that point of being an adult and having to adult all the time. Kids have it easy. I wish I could just be a kid again. My life would be fine. I wouldn't have any worries whatsoever if I could just be a kid again. Kids have worries. Kids absolutely have worries, and kids have fears, and kids are scared of stuff. So I think sometimes we as adults forget that, and we go, oh, well, you don't have bills, or you don't have a mortgage, or whatever. What have you got to worry about? Kids have tons of things to worry about. So I think horror and kids reading about other kids facing fears and conquering things and overcoming issues and finding solutions is a great way to go, okay, this is something that I'm not alone in. And there are monsters, or there are bullies, or there are haunted houses, or there are, zombie hordes. So there are things that I as a kid can do to help me get out of this situation, to help me get past this, or at least deal with it. So at least I'm setting a pattern that, hey, this is something that your kids can benefit from. And I also try to always throw something else in there. In this particular book, there's a lot of information about art and architecture and DIY. Not that you want your kids doing DIY, but it's not all complete scares the whole way through.
Yeah, please, Trish, jump in.
This is out of order in our list of questions, but I'll just jump in since this is related to Sean's horror question. Roddy laughs at first when Aunt Angie gives him a bowl for burning his hair from his comb. You know, he says, what, the hair monster is going to come and get me? But it turns out later, you know, when he's entangled and trapped and threatened. So there's a lot of humor in this book along with the horror. How do you figure out how to do that balance?
I think that horror and humor really do go hand in hand. I think moments of humor can give the reader just space to breathe. You can have this intense scene, or if you're doing sort of gothic and haunted house, it's sort of creeping, unsettled tone that sort of goes through the majority of the book. Maybe then you have this swelling scene, some actual scare. And just to give the reader a little bit of a breath and a little bit of a breather, I think humor can do a good job with that. Because a lot of people don't realize when they're reading, there are sort of hills and valleys built into the book. And if you're really good at what you do, you can sort of make that almost undetectable unless the reader's really looking for it. And then you just go, oh, this is a good place to break. This is a good place to stop. This is a good place to sort of catch my breath from the intensity of the prior scene. And I think sometimes people don't realize how important that break is in books and even in visual media. There is a TV show, I don't know if you watch The Bear. In I think it's season 2, there is an episode where the family all gets together at Christmas time. It's the Feast of the Seven Fishes episode. Jamie Lee Curtis is in that episode. She does an amazing, amazing job. But the episode is a little bit longer than their normal episodes, and it's done intentionally for the reader, but there is so much tension the whole episode, and it is purposefully done without the little moments, breaks, and breathers that you would get in a normal episode of sort of, oh, here's a witty quip here and there, or here's a little joke. And I think there's either a crock pot or something on the stove or a tea kettle that's sort of getting up to temperature throughout the episode, and you can see it's getting closer and closer to whistling, and it's just really, really well done. And you can see how an episode affects you as the viewer, and you don't have those breaks and those breathers, because you're just like on tenterhooks the whole episode. You're like, something's going to happen, and you just feel absolutely tense the whole time. And it's just really, really smart writing. So I try not to do that to kids. I try not to give them that much tension unbroken. So that's why I throw in humor to make it just.
That's interesting. I was trying to think the film that came to mind for horror that I could think of that had very distinct moments of comedy was Scream. Of course, very intentional as a film, but yet that film, if you think about, a horror movie from like that rough period of time, like what horror movie from then has had more of an impact on horror since? I mean, Scream is pretty, like, it's almost seminal at this point, right? Like, essential watching. And there is tons of very self-aware comedy. And then those moments when I feel like they create a moment where you feel like you're safe. And that's like when the film gets you, because you realize, oh, no, that was all, you're not safe. Nobody is. So I wonder if you get a break, but it's also like a reminder that that thing that scares you is still always there. It's not gone yet.
And agreed that Scream is very seminal in horror viewing. That is definitely something you should watch.
So I know Trish had raised in the question, but I figure we could talk about this because my guess is a lot of folks are not familiar with the practice of hair burning, and its relationship with hoodoo and other cultural expressions. And so I thought we could ask you to kind of talk a little bit about sort of where that kind of your sort of perspective on where that comes from and your sort of interest in exploring that in this particular book, because I think I was like reading some like random Reddit threads by people who were like asking like, why does my grandma keep asking me to burn my hair when we cut it off? And it was sort of like, well, because some people have probably lost some of the cultural tradition. Like they just do it because it's tradition, but they don't know the answer why. And to some degree, I feel like it's interesting that we have a book that is like doing it more deliberately. And so I hope you could kind of talk a little bit about that.
Oh, absolutely. It's also something that my editor, when we were going through edits, he said that part of his process is he looks things up on the internet as well, and he didn't see a lot about hair burning either. But from a hoodoo background, which hoodoo is a large, deep, and wide African traditional religion, so this is just a little sliver of that. But from a hoodoo perspective and a hexing, spellcasting perspective, you have to have something that belongs to a person in order to work a spell on them. And something like hair is usually something fairly easy to get because people get their hair cut or they brush their hair and they leave their hair in the comb. It's something very easy to retrieve as opposed to trying to find something more personal from a person. So that's why people who were brought up in a hoodoo tradition or have family members that were brought up in a hoodoo tradition have a tendency to burn their hair when it's been combed out or when it's been cut, because it's something that can easily be taken and used in spell work against you. One of the things I bring up in the book, and I think this is this a spoiler-free area or is this a spoiler-rich area? That's going to depend on how I take this.
You can spoil it. I would say not spoiling the end of the book, but okay. Other elements is okay. We can be like purposefully semi-vague if you need to.
Okay, I can be purposefully semi-vague. One of the stories that my grandmother told me when I was very little was that you have to be careful about how you dispose of / destroy your hair, because you don't want birds to get it, because birds will make a nest with your hair, which they do that, and it will cause you to have headaches. So I just grew up always being very, very cautious about that. Incidentally, birds will also take, your cat and dog fur and all that other sort of stuff as insulation for their nests. So that's why there's a lot of bird imagery in the Creepening, to make that tie back to that story, folktale, hoodoo practice, whatever terminology you'd like to use. So you'll notice there's a lot of bird imagery for Roddy to experience up until the climax of the book. Let's put it that way. That's my workaround for not spoiling things. Good job, Eden.
Good job. Yeah.
I just touching off that, I don't remember if it was stories about hoodoo or like European witchcraft or what, but when I came across that idea of sorcerers or whatever using your hair against you, for a while when I brushed my hair, I never burned it, but I would make little scissor cut motions above the trash can to cut the connection between it. So it's interesting how traditions can get adapted, or new people can come up with their own versions of things. I did want to ask you, in general, widening the scope from the haircutting question. Roddy is surprised when his aunt tells him about their family's hoodoo traditions, and later on they decide to try to reconstruct some of the conditions, do a scrapbook, and, learn more. I wonder if you could talk about how many Black American families have worked through generations of trauma and loss to hold on to their traditions, or if they have been lost within a family to revive them through research on what others what others in their culture have done.
Well, there are going to be families that have just always held on to the tradition. People that have stayed very close, whether it's physically close or at least sort of maintained connections to their roots. But a lot of people, going back in time a little bit to the Great Migration, where after the end of enslavement, a lot of people of African descent fled the American South or the North and for the West, hoping to make better lives for themselves. So a lot of times when those people left, they wanted to get complete new starts, and they wanted to leave behind what they saw as sometimes not just also a legacy of trauma and pain, but just a place that they felt was backwards and behind the times. So a lot of times they stepped away from those stories and they stepped away from those traditions. In the situation with Roddy's mom, she had such a frightening experience. She just said, I don't want to pass this on to my child. So she just made it seem like it had never happened and tried to move forward with her life and forget that traumatic incident. I'm noticing now, being on social media, so many people are deciding that they want to learn about hoodoo and other African traditional religions, learn about them in a way that isn't the way that they're typically portrayed in a lot of media, which is as this is a horrible, evil thing. And because you have encountered it, that makes you a horrible, evil person too, who must be destroyed. So learning that there are other people that really do want this information and they want to reconnect with their roots, whether it's to actually practice or whether it's to just be aware of the reality of a practice that has been butchered by a lot of people outside the community, and they really want a chance to learn from people who have a healthy respect for it and will teach them the realities as opposed to this version that is criminalized in a lot of situations. I think that answers your question.
It's very interesting. I'm rewatching Dexter at the moment, and well, it's not hoodoo per se. They have Santa Muerte, which is being presented and being used. It's season 5, so like it's being used in a very particular way, and it made me definitely think when you were speaking of all the ways that we often have these like religions and different cultural practices that are associated with the mystical or the magical from non-Western cultures. They often are in the West sensationalized and made scary or titillating, or like they highlight all of the maybe like the parts that's normally would seem less friendly, I suppose you could say. And we do the opposite with, I would say, most of like how we treat, say, Christianity as an example. So that's the dominant religion in the United States, where there are lots of really kind of disturbing parts of Christianity, but we kind of like downplay those and just highlight all the really like nice, happy parts. So we sort of like flipped it, thinking about like the Eucharist, for example, which is either symbolically or literally for you, the blood and flesh of Christ, right? Well, that's a form of cannibalism, right? But we sort of gloss over that. We kind of like minimize it. And so like we take like Santa Muerte and we like point out all of the violence associated, quote unquote, with it. and we highlight all that and like take out all of the sort of cultural presentations where people are praying or working together in communities, etc. It seems just so. I mean, I'm sure there's a reason for it. I don't know. You might have thoughts on this, Eden, but you just made me really think about that dichotomy being presented. That it just to me feels nonsense.
Well, one of the things, as far as like, not getting into the transubstantiation, of it all,
Sure.
but there's this, and I don't really know the best terminology for it, but looking at the transatlantic slave trade where people were kidnapped and brought through the Caribbean to the American South and given this Christianity as religion, where people who were enslaved had to sort of reconcile these two things. Like, I've been brought up in this particular tradition, and now I'm being told that if I don't absorb this other tradition, then, I'm going to be eaten or brutalized or whatever have you. So someone reached out to me about an interview, and they wanted to talk to me about, I think it was specifically about root magic. And she said something about being a pagan in reference to me. And I said, well, I think that you have, the wrong understanding of hoodoo. And something that I mention in Creepening, because hoodoo is different things to different people, as I've sort of touched on, with some people wanting to learn it because it is part of their heritage. Other people, it is the religion that they practice. For other people, it's something that they want to research purely from an intellectual level to just sort of add it to their understanding of the world. So it's not just this one thing. And most people who are hoodoos or consider themselves to be hoodoos are Christians, are, for the most part, probably Protestants. And it is something that I think from the outside looking in, and it's going back to the way that these religions are portrayed on screen and in lots of novels, as this, pagan, anti-everything this. So I think a lot of times what my realization is that a lot of people have a glancing understanding of what hoodoo and those religions are. And it's been painted in a way because you can get shows anywhere from Dexter to Criminal Minds to NCIS. They've got a voodoo episode. They've got a Santeria episode, so, and it's usually at Halloween, so it's one of those things where it's a titillating way to portray to a viewer something creepy and weird that they don't understand or they don't know. And it really is a way of life for a lot of people that have average everyday lives, that go to work every day, that pay their taxes, that pay their mortgages. It's not this eerie, creeping thing that a lot of people seem to think it is.
It's sort of like, to some degree, if you don't mind me saying, you're not the only one doing this, but it is kind of lovely that we get to read your books, because whether you intentionally are doing this, your books are kind of challenging that portrayal and giving us a more nuanced and, it's not always pretty, but no practice really is perfect all the time, right? But it is a thing where it is about human beings engaged in cultural practice or religious practice, in all of the lovely and beautiful ways that can be, because there's community and family and all of these things associated with these practices, which I think in this book is very strongly represented, even in pretty much all of them. I think all of your middle grade in particular does this. So Yeah. You got a thing going on, Eden. Just you what I don't know. I don't want to keep I could ask way more questions because I have so many like
Oh, I have some more.
related
Please
questions.
do, or
Sorry. Well, let me bring this one up. Aunt Angie, at first, she seems like a neglectful relative, being so hard to get in contact with. It turns out that Angie herself had felt abandoned by her older sister, Roddy's mom. It turns out, they were both too hurt or scared, or both people just doing the best they can. So my question is, when should you believe what people's actions appear to be telling you, and when should you try to look beyond the surface?
That's a good question. I think it's challenging because it really depends on your history with a person. If you have little to no history with a person and you can't say this type of treatment is something that recurs again and again with this person, they're dismissive of me, or they tend to not listen, or they're avoidant when it comes to my wanting their
Hang on.
help or whatever, then you can use that history to make a decision on, all right, at what point am I going to either say something, ask to talk with them about it, or just go, what's going on? But in Roddy's situation, he doesn't have a lot of knowledge of his aunt. He's spoken to her maybe once or twice a year through video chat because she has the type of job that keeps her on the move. And it sends her to lots of remote places. She'll send him a Christmas gift or she'll send him a birthday gift. But it's really not like they've spent time together and they have a lot of history for him to go, well, why didn't she come and pick me up from the orphanage earlier? Why wasn't she just a person who calls every week to see what's going on? He didn't have a basis to make that decision really because his mother and his aunt had that kind of relationship of, well, they'll call if something happens. Otherwise, I'll talk to them when I've got time or when I come up for air. And I don't think that's an unusual relationship for a lot of people nowadays. They'll have all good intentions of getting in touch, and life just happens. And all of a sudden, it's 2 months since you've spoken, or 3 months since you've spoken, or a year. And you go, oh my gosh, I haven't talked to you since your birthday last year. What have you been doing? And that's been Roddy's experience. So he just goes, well, I really don't have enough knowledge of her. I don't know whether I can trust what she's going to say. Is she really going to be there? Does she really love me as a family member? How can she love me? Does she really even know me as a person? Why wouldn't she sort of make time to come see me? Not really thinking that his aunt probably does harbor a little bit of memory that's not so great about her own sister. But she puts that aside and goes, okay, I'm now changing my whole life. Come back to South Carolina to pick you up. And I think that speaks volumes about her as a person. And I'm going to take this house that we own off the rental market because kids need a house, kids need a yard, kids need all of these things that Aunt Angie thinks that kids need, who Aunt Angie doesn't have kids. This was not in her life plan to take care of her nephew. But she just goes, I'm here. I'm going to do it. I don't know what I'm doing. I'll Google childcare tips and it'll be fine.
So Roddy is a very good boy. He wants to please people. He wants to be useful. So many of his struggles to adjust and adapt to his new family situation are very quiet, unsubtle, or even just internal and not expressed outwardly at all. He's also brave and he's clever. I loved reading this story. I get really tired of what seems like a whole lot of middle grade protagonists who are just brats, and I just want them to go ahead and grow up already and be decent to each other. But I wonder, is Roddy maybe a little too good to believe?
I think that there is this stereotype that in order to be a middle grade protagonist, you've got to be. Sometimes people think that a character has got to be that way in order to lead a book. They've got to be, scrabbly and willing to be argumentative and talk back and do all this stuff. And I don't think that's the case. And especially for a kid whose his father died before he was born. He doesn't remember his father. His mother died in a terrible accident, and there wasn't anybody there. There wasn't anybody there that went, I'm going to swoop in and take care of you immediately. And he had to go live in an orphanage. And he didn't know anybody. And he told people that I do have an aunt, but she works somewhere. This is her email address. And what's he supposed to do? And I think that takes a toll on a kid that probably may have been a bit more vibrant before this. So he's starting from a point of, yeah, I used to like to go on roller coasters and I used to like to do all this stuff and go to the fair and blah, blah, blah. And my mom and I used to do all this stuff. To a point of, I spent 2 months here alone, and does somebody not check their email for 2 months? And is this just going to be my life now? And he hears all this stuff, that you can't probably avoid being in an orphanage that's got staff who sort of talk about things and kids overhear things. And almost 13. If kids get adopted, they're usually not already 13. And a lot of times people want to adopt girls because people think that they're easier. So he is aware that 13-year-old boys they're not top of the list usually for getting adopted. And so there's this stuff sort of swirling around in his head going, well, what's life going to be like for me now? And I think it sort of fits his personality of being this kid that's like had several traumatic things happen and is wondering, okay, am I going to get another family? And if I do, I need to do what I can to keep it. I need to be a good kid. Not saying he wasn't a good kid with his mom, but early on in the book, they get to the haunted house, and in and among all these rooms and dilapidated everything, his aunt and uncle have managed to finish decorating and repairing one room. They've finished the kitchen, and they've got a table set up, and they've got him this lovely cake to welcome him. And he says, before this, if his mom brought home a cake, he'd be like, oh, great cake, and I'll eat it. But it's been 2 months without his mom. And now the fact that his aunt and uncle have bought him this cake, it's this powerful moment of, this is something that someone planned and bought for me. And the past 2 months, I've just been treated like every other kid here in this orphanage. I've not been treated poorly, but I haven't been treated as someone special. And that's even what the Miss Penny who runs the orphanage says to him. Don't you want to go with your aunt and uncle? Don't you want to have a home? I have to treat all the kids here the same. That's part of what I do here. Don't you want to feel special? And he sort of wrestles with that. And he goes, well, I kind of do, but I don't know what else that new place is going to bring. So he's almost overwhelmed when he's presented with this cake. And it's this small gesture that we don't necessarily always think of as something important. But he hasn't had that feeling for 2 months, and 2 months is a long time, to be without someone.
It dawns on me that in thinking about a lot of your work and to some of what you'd spoken of just here, that it's you're I mean, I suppose it comes to the territory of horror to some degree, but dealing with the trauma of loss, and all of the various ways you can interpret that, both literal in the sense of like losing a loved one to maybe losing the security of one home, having to move, which you've dealt with in a few of these in different ways. Um, and I'm kind of curious as you're dealing in the middle grade space, and you kind of said when we talked like horror earlier that essentially kids can handle a lot more than we give them credit for. And I wonder if you could speak to what for you is like a story element. What, why do you find that such a compelling idea to explore as it relates to the technical audience, for middle grade writing? Why these traumatic experiences? What for you sort of draws you to those? I guess as a novelist.
I think it's because kids do have traumatic experiences that sometimes happen. I think it's important to have all kinds of books. I think there's an importance to having joy-filled books for kids, but I think there's also an importance to having books for kids where the protagonist has scars, whether they're physical or mental or emotional, to show that things affect characters and they can still move forward. They can still be the main character in a story. Just because something happens to you, sometimes through no fault of your own, sometimes there are books where kids actually cause the problem and then have to fix it, have to figure it out, later. But I think that a lot of times life happens. Life happens to people. And we can sit here and go, well, yes, but I want to make sure that kids have joyous things. And that's absolutely important. But a lot of times as adults, it's hard to talk to kids about difficult topics. So a lot of times we avoid talking about difficult topics. And we don't want to say, oh, well, this kid has had the loss of a loved one, or there's been some traumatic event that's happened at their school, which, as we know, kids face those things now. They have drills for that. So it's hard to sort of start that conversation sometimes for adults because a lot of us, in some ways, are non confrontational, or we don't want to deal with a kid in the same way we would deal with an adult. Some of us are happy to talk with an adult and go, look, we have to have a conversation and be clear about these things. You may not want to go to a kid and say that. So a lot of times I write books to give parents or adults a way to sort of have a springboard into talking about subjects. But it's hard sometimes to find that in. And I think Root Magic, Conjure Island, and now Creepening, they give adults an in to talk with their kids. You go to the back of the book and you read the synopsis. Depending on if your kid's into fantasy or magic or spooky stuff, you can say, hey, do you want to read this book? It's about a kid who, dot, dot, dot. And you go, can we read it together? Or do you want to talk with me at any point about it? And it's a way to sort of reference, hey, this happened to this character, and I know you know someone that happened to, or I know that happened to you. Because we all want to sort of see ourselves reflected in fiction in some way, shape, or form. And I think that goes beyond, you know, visibility of I want to see more female characters, or I want to see more characters of this ethnicity, or I want to see more characters of, this, gender preference. It goes into I want to see more characters that have had these experiences. and I want to see more characters who have had to deal with these types of things.
Good answer. Great. Well, I know Trish, you've got a couple more. I want to talk about the Southern Gothic, but I figured that could be the last one before we go to our stock questions because it's kind of not
Okay.
specific just to this book. So,
Oh, let me follow.
Okay.
Sorry,
Absolutely.
let me follow on a little bit with parents or parental figures setting good examples in your writing. They're getting to the house, and Angie's aunt says, "Here are the rules. You can talk to us anytime." And I forget wear your shoes around the house because there's some dangerous construction going on. And he's waiting. What are the rest of the rules? I guess I'll find out when I break a rule and get punished for it. I guess the aunt should have said, "And that's it," or something like that. So clarity for children can be very important to help them figure stuff out. I also wanted to mention the lovely memories that Roddy has of his mom, and some of the best ones are of them cooking together, and the nightly ritual, not in a magical sense, but just what they do every night of her braiding his hair. And that's a very personal, loving gesture that, he doesn't want anyone else to touch his hair, even. But cooking and hair braiding, I guess some authors might consider this atypical for a boy to have as his treasured memories. Is that just backward thinking, or did you ever consider maybe writing the child protagonist as a girl, or do you want to just talk about, how you came to these moments to be the expressive ones?
Oh, absolutely. I wanted to write a boy protagonist this time, and I never imagined Roddy as a girl. I always imagined him as a boy, because I think a lot of times people do still sort of equate longer hair with girls, and there are plenty of boys that grow their hair out or decide that they don't want to cut their hair. And I feel like, especially from a point of view of, I guess, avoiding a stereotype in a way, there are lots of little boys that their moms braid their hair at night, or in the, not necessarily only their moms, but in Roddy's case, it was his mom, but someone will braid their hair for them. And I think it was, especially for me, important because Root Magic had twins, even though it was really Jez's story, probably she took the lead a little bit more. Belle in Conjure Island is a girl, and I thought, okay, I really do want to write a boy protagonist. And I thought, haunted house, around after monsters, this needs to be a boy. And I feel like there are ideas of boys should have shorter hair, or after a certain age you should cut boys' hair, or whatever have you. And I just wanted to sort of step away from that, but step away from it in a way that I didn't necessarily explain it. I didn't want there to be sort of this assumption that, well, girls have long hair, and him getting teased about having long hair or anything like that. I wanted it to be this total normal sort of, okay, he's got a huge afro, and you can braid it, and he actually has longer hair when the curls are stretched out. So I just went, it's a totally normal thing. I'm not going to even explain or justify it. And anyone that is unfamiliar with, little black boys having longer hair that's in braids, I'm sure you can go on the popular or hip hop music section of your music streaming platform of choice, and look at lots of pictures of people that have longer hair. So I thought we're just going to lean fully into this as a normal everyday thing.
Well, I loved how it was in the text, and, it all felt totally right and natural there to me, so I'm sorry to have asked you to justify it in this interview, but I thought that some people maybe could use a little education in that respect. Sorry.
Oh, absolutely. No. That was absolutely fine. And, I guess that means that the next thing I write is going to have a girl that has, absolutely no hair and just lean fully into that. Not, putting things on my to write list or anything like that.
Well, we got a little bit of the, brave little girl and later a girl with the pixie cut in Roddy's mom, even though he has trouble thinking of, his mom and his aunt as people who were at one time little girls or teenagers. But they do have, you do have a bit of a role model for little girls in this too.
It's true. You're right. You're absolutely right. Pixie cuts rule.
Well, okay, so I have to ask a Southern Gothic question.
Okay.
To be frank, we've asked you about this, I think, every time you've been on the show, but usually it's like Jen that asks a version of this question, and Jen couldn't be here because Jen is currently at Disney World stealing puppets. So,
as you do,
as you do, she doesn't know that I've said this publicly, and you know what? That's what you get, Jen. How dare you take math classes or whatever it is you're doing right now instead of being on my show more, you jerk. You and your puppet stealing at Disney World. But okay, so one of the things I think was, I had thought about it, but I don't think we really asked this. Like, it seems to me that there's like a renaissance of the Southern Gothic going on, question mark, because, if you look at like the term and how it's been applied, I mean, the Southern Gothic probably extends at least a century, if not more, give or take, right? If you decades, depending on your perspective. And it's been associated with all kinds of different authors, and it has a very interesting historical relationship to sort of the period after the Civil War and all of the many things that are associated with that period. And yet, what I've noticed is we're seeing so much more Southern Gothic in the last decade, 20 years that are, approaching many of the similar themings that we've seen in earlier works that have been associated with this genre, but coming from writers from very different perspectives. And yours is one of the most unique because your work has explored everything from hoodoo to the Gullah Geechee to a variety of different subcultures within the South. And I'm super curious from your, like, do you feel that there is a kind of like revitalization of the Southern Gothic that is offering a very different way of thinking about this sort of subgenre movement, or however we want to call it? Is that how you feel, or do you just, maybe you have a different view of it? I'm just curious.
I don't think there's necessarily a renaissance. I think we've always been here, and I think we've always been writing Southern Gothic works. I think the difference is more people are embracing the term Southern Gothic, because historically it's always been a very literary term. And a lot of speculative fiction writers weren't using the term Gothic or Southern Gothic or insert demographic here, Gothic. It's just, I think, a resurgence of people using the term, blank Gothic. One of the reasons I'm going to guess that the Gothic has taken such a foothold, and this has no basis other than my own belief, so grain of salt. We spent a very long time with grimdark being very prevalent, and lots of hack and slash, lots of blood and gore, lots of devastation of people and places and things. Before that, there was a lot of post-apocalyptic fiction that had taken a deep foothold. And so also devastation and desolation and downer endings, for lack of a better term. And I think that possibly one of the reasons Gothic has gotten such a foothold now is people still love dark fiction, and people still like horror, and people still like creepiness. But I think the Gothic is almost in response to that. We spent a lot of time with complete devastation. We spent a lot of time with heavy brutality. And the Gothic allows you to embrace things in with a much lighter touch in a lot of ways. Not saying that Gothic fiction can't be devastating. I think it can be. But a lot of times you're not going to see tons of blood and gore. You can still have emotionally devastating things happen. You can still have shocking things happen. Hello, V.C. Andrews' Flowers in the Attic series, of books. If you haven't read them, no spoilers, Wikipedia page. So I think that Gothic allows you to have a wide range of things included, lots of folkloric elements, lots of exploration of the psychological, lots of exploration of how nuanced things can build up and affect our psyches and can affect us emotionally, as well as things happening, from a physical point of view, which is what a lot of people seem to only focus on with horror. And it isn't only body horror. It's, horror can come at you from lots of ways at the same time. So I think Gothic is something that gives people that dark fiction feel, but without wiping a landscape of humanity or, without slaughtering a lot of people or lots of blood and gore flying around. It can still be spooky, it can still be creepy, it can still be unsettling, it can still linger with you after you've turned the TV off or shut the book. I think I expect that might be a response to some of that.
You might be right,
like
though.
I said,
you're kind of identifying like that there's something maybe valuable in like the tension of like a foreboding experience where it's not necessarily graphic, but yet the terror is still there, or the unsettlingness is still there. Like a haunted house doesn't have to have a moment where like all the windows are pouring blood like in a Stanley Kubrick film. Although great, I love The Shining, to be clear. But it doesn't have to have that moment like the elevators open up and it's like it's an ocean of blood. Just the very act that something's wrong, something's not quite right, and you can't quite put your finger on it, and every time you go to reach for it, it's not quite there, and it's like the mystery of like not having the full answer of like what is really fully going on, which
absolutely, and there are a lot of books coming out now. My novella Hollow Tongue deals with a haunted house. Danye Coles' Midnight Rooms, which recently came out. Del Sandine's This Cursed House, which I think comes out later this year, deals with it. And I think there are a lot of people realizing that they can use horror in a way to explore lots of topics, in a way that people can grasp and understand. And horror isn't just, some masked man chasing you through a campground.
Yeah, very much so.
Although I did see that movie. I haven't seen it. I don't think that I plan on seeing it, but I think it's called In a Violent Nature or A Violent Nature. It's supposed to be a very intense film about a serial killer or about I think the guy's got a mask and an axe. I'm assuming he's a serial killer. Someone saw it, and they didn't comment anything on the movie except They found the crunch of leaves under the killer's feet very soothing. I didn't think anything else about these kills or the violence of it, so I still have no idea what that part of it is like. They just said, "Oh, just hearing this killer walking through this wood and the leaves crunching underfoot was very soothing." And I thought, until the screams of the people that he's killing happen, I don't know, no idea. But no, I feel like one of the other things too that Gothic is very good for is Gothic ties in with other subgenres really, really well. So if you want to have, a bit of comedy or you want to have a bit of romance, it works really, really well with Gothic, as opposed to, the slashers where they may have scenes of an intimate nature, but it's usually not necessarily romance or, romantic or anything. It's, we need to have a nude scene or a partial nudity scene, so we're going to put this in here, as opposed to, Gary Oldman portraying someone that has crossed oceans of time to, be with you.
No.
Well, that's one of the really interesting things is how different people get different reactions to stories, and, the things that are in there that you didn't even know maybe were in there that people are going to pull out of them and say, "Oh, wow, I love this." And you're like, "Yeah, I meant to do that." Do you get much of that?
I have, funnily enough, I don't have lots of people mention, responses to my work to me. I don't know why. I don't get, I think people have sort of learned to not tag authors in reviews like on social media or anything, but I very rarely have anybody ever just say, "Hey, I read your book and I really liked how you did XYZ." So I don't really have too much of a basis for that. But I do know that other authors have had that happen. And sometimes they'll go, "Oh, yeah, that was totally intentional, and I'm so glad someone noticed." Or sometimes they just go, "I didn't really see that, but now that you mention it, yeah, I totally see how that, manifested in the story." So maybe one day someone will reach out and go, "Hey, I noticed that you did this thing." And then at that point, I can just go, "Yeah, that was totally intentional." Or not. So,
Or not.
I don't know. I look forward to that happening, actually.
I'll do it to you at a convention.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll just come up and I'll say something and then I will walk swiftly away. And I'll say it cryptically. It'll be like the crunching of the leaves. It'll just be like that.
You could do it, and not even pause when you're walking. Just as you are approaching and you come by, just say it and just continue to walk.
Just leave you bewildered.
I'll just go, did I really hear that? Was he even talking to me?
And you'll just spend the rest of the day being like, "What was that about? What's happening?"
Was that even Sean? You could be dressed like Gary Oldman in Bram Stoker's Dracula. Just, swish your cape around and just be gone.
Oh man, I don't know that I am committed to this bit enough to be fully set up like him in that movie, because that makeup must have taken a long time.
Just not the white-haired version. The whole I'm now dressed in the style of the time, and putting some effort into my appearance so that I can woo her to be my partner for eternity.
Oh, yeah, it still wouldn't
Say
work
it's
on
like
me.
this great silk number.
Okay, well, fortunately, we got to wrap up, and so we have two big questions for you, which is one is, what are you working on next?
I am working on several things at once, which is probably why I'm like spread so thin right now. But right now, I just turned in the draft of my YA Southern Gothic horror. It is about the South Carolina Black debutantes. Um, so I have no idea. I might get edits back on that in the next month. We'll see how that goes. And the next thing I'm working on, I have planned this. I haven't plotted this, but I've really kind of wanted to write a full-on just mystery, just murder mystery. So I'm in the process of figuring out how I want to do that. I know that I want it to be a supernatural mystery, and I know that I want to set it probably in like southern city somewhere, but I'm working on what kind of investigator am I going to have? Am I going to go full cozy and have someone, I don't know, they usually own a cake shop or something? Or am I going to, come up with somebody that's a professional investigator? So I'm trying to, sort that out and figure out who my investigator is going to be. And then that way, that'll be sort of the lead in with how are we going to make this, mystery thing a reality? So I kind of always wanted to write a mystery. So I think that might be the next thing that I tackle. But before that, I've got a couple of short stories that I want to get done this year.
Nice.
I think that'll probably tie up my entire, rest of 2024.
Cool. Well, I've loved your short stories that I've read before this, and I really look forward to, keeping on track with what you come up with in the future.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it greatly. I feel like I have to show this book again. I have been so excited to get this copy finally, in my hands, and the fact that it showed up today.
Yeah, most of my books are ebooks, and I've read stories on various sites. But my sister actually lent me this copy of Who Lost. I found short stories by you. So, yeah, definitely listeners should check out.
Thank you to her for lending it.
Definitely listeners should check out Eden Royce in many forms that she's written.
Please do. Please do.
Well, if people want to do that, well, yeah, the second one is where do folks find you?
Right. I am ready for this. Okay. So you can find me at my website, which is edenroyce.com. I now have a nice new tab on there for my newsletter. So if you decide to join my newsletter, I will be putting out a new one shortly, because now that I have my copies, I will be giving away a few of them. So sign up for the newsletter to find out how you can sign up to be in the running to do that. I am also on Instagram at Eden Royce Books. I am also on, I guess we're calling it X now. I guess it's X now. At Eden Royce. So I'm there not very often anymore, but occasionally. And I'm also on Blue Sky. So that's, don't even ask me. It's Eden Royce, something social, Blue Sky, something. You'll see it. I have a link tree that's in my bio most places. So that link tree has links to Blue Sky and Insta and all that good stuff. So find me at one of those places and sign up for the newsletter as well.
Well, Eden, thank you very much for coming on the show. I know this is, I say this a lot. It's really, really hard for people to put up with us. So I appreciate it that you've just given us a good chunk of your time today.
Well, it was an absolute pleasure, and I'm still holding you to this promise that we're supposedly going to all get on a call and talk Event Horizon one of these days.
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I want to do it because I love that movie.
I absolutely adore that movie. So just putting it out there at some point in the future, if you think about it.
We may have to do a torture cinema because then
it's not torture cinema though.
Movie.
I mean, it's a scary movie, but it's not a bad
movie. Look at the score. Hold on, no. Like, look at the score of Event Horizon. It has a 34% on Rotten Tomatoes. Like, people don't like this movie. They're wrong, but they don't like it.
Well, then I guess it does qualify for what we do on Torture Cinema.
But it has its devotees.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes.
People that are devoted to this movie are devoted to this movie.
I 100% am. I love this movie. It's so good. It's Sam Neill, you guys. Come on.
Come on.
Maybe we could do that in October. I forget if we have a plan already.
Very possible. I mean, I don't know. It's a Halloween episode, so we just do a horror movie. So for that, yeah. But okay, well, we will hold this. We're gonna hold this in our little box and see if we can make something happen. But in any case, thanks again, Eden. This is wonderful. We appreciate you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you both for having me. It was a delight, as always.
Aw. Well, for folks at home, if you think we're delightful and you'd like to let us know what you thought about this episode or any other one, again, skiffyandfanty.com/listener suggestions. We are Skiffy and Fanty pretty much anywhere on the internet, so it's pretty easy to find us. Skiffy and Fanty most places. We also have a link tree, which is just /Skiffy and Fanty, linktr.ee. So get our newsletter, all that stuff there. Please, Patreon, if you like us, give us all your money because we're poor. And then give us reviews on places because then more people will find us and then they'll join our Patreon and give us all their money because we're poor. For me, I'm at SeanDuke.net. I am here on Twitch, Alphabet Streams. I do my stuff Tuesdays, Thursdays at 7, and then Skiffy again is every Friday at 7 p.m. Central. And then I have a link tree with all my stuffs on it, which is /SeanDuke.
You can find me, Trish, on Blue Sky at P.E. Matson, on Mastodon at newsy.social at TrishEM, and on my blog, www.whatsthewordnow.blogspot.com. I also write reviews for Skiffy and Fanty, as do several other people who are really good at it. So do check out the blog as well as the podcast, please.
Trish, can I just ask a question?
Sure.
How big is that cough drop? Because when you moved it so that you could talk, it was like your whole mouth had to like operate to get that thing over. And I was like, what? Well, how big was it? It didn't look big when you put it in.
Just a normal sized Ricola, honey lemon eucalyptus cough drop.
You don't have like 6 in
there? I didn't mean to mess you up mentally, Sean, just by moving it to the side of my cheek so that I could talk.
It just looked like you were having so much difficulty. Like, it was just too big. Like, you got a ball of chew or something that you had to get over.
Well, I think you've made this sufficiently awkward already, Sean.
I have. I think on that note, awkward ending and scene.
Take care of yourselves and each other.
If you want to support this show, you can go to patreon.com/skiffyandfanty or skiffyandfanty.com, our website, where you can get access to all of our fancy things. Our music comes from Holy Mole. You can support him and his work at patreon.com/holymole. Thank you for listening.